There is a quiet moment that almost no one notices. It happens not in crisis, not in loss, not in triumph, but in ordinary life. You are standing somewhere familiar. A room, a street, a screen glowing late at night. Nothing dramatic occurs, yet something inside you tightens. A look from someone, a tone, a silence. And suddenly your inner world shifts. You feel smaller, defensive, irritated, unseen, or strangely drawn in. You tell yourself it is about them, their attitude, their energy, their behavior. But what if this moment is not about them at all? What if it is an invitation? Most people believe they are reacting to the world as it is. But the psyche does not meet reality directly. It meets it through layers of memory, expectation, fear, longing, and unfinished inner movements. The world you experience is filtered through what you have not yet resolved within yourself. That is why two people can face the same situation and walk away with entirely different meanings carved into their minds. One feels rejected, the other feels untouched. One feels threatened, the other remains calm. This text is not about becoming wiser, better, or more powerful. It is about becoming more precise, more honest, less hypnotized by appearances. It is about recognizing that every emotional reaction is a message, every irritation a clue, every admiration a signal pointing inward. When you learn to read these signals correctly, the outer world loses its power to confuse you. People no longer feel unpredictable. You stop trying to decode them. You begin to recognize patterns. And quietly, without effort, clarity appears. This is not the clarity of control. It is the clarity of seeing. And once you see, you cannot unsee. The psyche is not a neutral observer standing outside of life. It is a living field that constantly shapes, filters, and organizes experience long before awareness has time to intervene. What you call reality does not arrive raw. It arrives edited, structured, colored by inner material that existed before the moment itself. The mind does not wait to understand and then react. It reacts first and explains later. At the deepest level, perception is not a mirror, but a pattern recognition system. The unconscious is always scanning, not for truth, but for familiarity. Its primary concern is not accuracy, but orientation. It asks again and again whether something resembles what has already been lived, felt, or survived. Familiarity creates the illusion of safety, and safety, not truth, is the unconscious priority. This is why the first emotional response feels so convincing. It arrives fully formed, without hesitation, carrying the weight of certainty. It feels immediate and personal, as if something essential has been revealed. Yet this speed is precisely what makes it unreliable. The faster a conclusion appears, the more likely it has bypassed awareness entirely. Reflection takes time. Conditioning does not. What is often labeled intuition is, in many cases, memory activating itself through the body. An old emotional imprint recognizes a similar tone, posture, rhythm, or silence, and declares meaning. The present moment becomes a stage onto which the past quietly steps forward. The face may be new, but the feeling is not. And because the feeling is familiar, it feels true. The psyche does not differentiate between then and now in the way the conscious mind believes it does. Emotional memory is not linear. It is associative. It links by resonance, not by logic. A glance that resembles past disapproval, a pause that echoes abandonment, a confidence that reminds the body of authority. None of these need to be accurate to be powerful. They only need to be similar enough to awaken an old response. This is how illusion forms, not as deception, but as misattribution. The meaning belongs to an earlier chapter of life, yet it is projected onto the present moment. The outer world becomes a canvas for unfinished inner movements. And because this process happens below awareness, it feels objective. It feels as though the world itself is producing the emotion, when in truth, the emotion is meeting the world halfway. When you believe you are reading people, you are often reading patterns that were installed long before you met them. Authority is not experienced as authority, but as remembered submission or defiance. Distance is not simply distance, but the echo of separation. Attention is not neutral, but a signal tied to worth, survival, or belonging. The person in front of you becomes a symbol without knowing it. The danger does not lie in having these reactions. They are unavoidable. The psyche must organize reality somehow. The danger lies in mistaking these internal responses for facts. When perception is not questioned, it solidifies. Interpretation becomes belief. Belief becomes identity. And identity begins to defend its version of reality as if it were the only one possible. This is how misunderstanding persists. Not because people are deceptive, but because perception is layered. Two individuals can inhabit the same moment and walk away with entirely different worlds constructed inside them. One feels rejected, another remains unaffected. One senses threat, another senses nothing at all. The event did not change. The internal landscape did. The outer world appears unstable when the inner world is unresolved. Confusion is not produced by life itself, but by the collision between present experience and unintegrated memory. When emotional residues remain unconscious, they continue to shape perception silently. They do not announce themselves as past. They present themselves as now. This is why clarity does not come from analyzing others, but from observing how meaning is formed within. The moment you notice how quickly a story appears, how rapidly certainty arrives, how automatically judgment forms, you step out of illusion and into awareness. The world does not suddenly change, but your relationship to it does. Perception becomes slower, less absolute. You begin to sense the difference between what is happening and what is being remembered through it. And in that space, something subtle but powerful occurs. Reality regains depth. People become less threatening, less idealized, less confusing. They are no longer carriers of old roles. They are simply present. The outer world was never the illusion itself. The illusion was believing that perception was neutral. When that belief loosens, the psyche stops projecting certainty where there is only interpretation. And from that moment on, seeing becomes quieter, more precise, and infinitely more honest. Every human being learns, often very early, that complete exposure carries a cost. The psyche discovers that certain feelings, impulses, questions, and sensitivities do not receive protection in the outer world. From this discovery, the persona forms, not as deception, but as adaptation. It is the part of the psyche that negotiates between the inner world and external reality. It answers a single silent question. How must I appear in order to remain safe, accepted, or intact? The persona is not artificial, it is functional. It allows the individual to move through society, to work, to relate, to be seen without being wounded. Confidence develops where insecurity once threatened. Competence grows where chaos once existed. Morality sharpens where instinct felt dangerous. Charm appears where rejection was once feared. These qualities are not false, they are constructed. And construction implies necessity. To misunderstand the persona is to believe that authenticity means removing it entirely. But the psyche cannot survive without some form of mediation. The mask is not the enemy. It is the architecture of survival, refined into presentation. The problem arises only when the persona is mistaken for the whole, when the mask is no longer worn, but believed. A strong persona often creates confusion in perception. It appears convincing, coherent, even admirable. Yet what is encountered is not essence, but strategy. Strategy always develops around vulnerability. The psyche builds strength where it once felt weak. It builds certainty where doubt once threatened coherence. The more refined the mask, the more carefully it has been shaped to cover something tender beneath. This does not mean that people are hiding something malicious. It means they are protecting something unfinished. The persona is a shield, not a weapon. And shields are built in response to perceived danger. When you encounter a rigid or polished exterior, you are witnessing the outline of an inner sensitivity that has not yet been allowed full exposure. The mistake of perception occurs when the observer reacts to the mask rather than recognizing its function. Judgment freezes understanding. Admiration distorts it. Both miss the movement underneath. When a persona is attacked, the psyche defends it aggressively, because to threaten the mask feels like threatening survival itself. This is why confrontation often strengthens appearances rather than dissolving them. Seeing the persona clearly requires inner steadiness. It requires the ability to remain present without needing to classify, diagnose, or penetrate. Curiosity opens space. Evaluation closes it. The moment judgment appears, perception narrows. Behavior becomes interpreted rather than observed. The observer stops seeing structure and begins assigning motive. When curiosity replaces evaluation, something subtle shifts. The mask begins to speak without words. Patterns reveal themselves through consistency. The tone never changes. The posture remains fixed. The narrative repeats. What once seemed like personality becomes rhythm, and rhythm reveals function. A persona does not hide by silence. It hides by repetition. Repeats what works. It clings to roles that once protected it. Authority, humor, distance, helpfulness, superiority, innocence. Each is a solution to a past vulnerability. Each emerged to solve a problem that once felt existential. The more rigid the role, the more important it once was. Flexibility indicates safety. Rigidity signals unresolved threat. When a persona cannot soften, it is because the psyche beneath it does not yet trust the environment. Understanding this changes perception entirely. What once appeared as arrogance now reveals fragility. What once seemed cold reveals guardedness. What once felt performative reveals fear of disappearance. The persona is not removed through exposure. It dissolves through safety. And safety cannot be forced. It arises when the psyche senses that it will not be reduced, shamed, or invaded. This is why genuine presence disarms more effectively than analysis. The mask relaxes not when it is named, but when it is no longer needed. To see the persona without attacking it is to allow complexity without collapse. It is to recognize that the surface is meaningful without mistaking it for the depth. When perception matures, the observer no longer tries to reach behind the mask. They allow it to exist, while remaining aware that it is not the whole. In this state, understanding becomes quieter. The observer stops demanding truth and starts allowing process. The persona is seen as movement, not obstacle. And in that movement, something human becomes visible. Not through exposure, but through patience. Not through force, but through steadiness. When the mask is seen without judgment, it no longer needs to harden. And when it softens, essence does not rush forward dramatically. It emerges gradually in pauses, in inconsistencies, in moments where strategy loosens its grip. This is not revelation. It is integration beginning to breathe. Fear is often misunderstood because it is associated with collapse, avoidance, or fragility. But at the psychological level, fear is not a breakdown of function. It is a system of orientation. It tells the psyche what mustn't be lost. Long before values, beliefs, or intentions are consciously formed, fear has already mapped the terrain. It establishes borders. It determines movement. It decides where energy flows and where it withdraws. Every individual carries a central fear that silently organizes their behavior. This fear is rarely articulated. It does not appear as panic or anxiety in daily life. Instead, it expresses itself through preference, attachment, defensiveness, ambition, and control. The psyche builds itself around what it cannot afford to lose. Some fear the loss of image. Their structure becomes performance. Words are chosen carefully. Mistakes feel catastrophic. Criticism feels like erasure. Others fear the loss of closeness. Their structure becomes attunement. They monitor emotional distance, adapt constantly, and feel destabilized by withdrawal. Some fear the loss of autonomy. Their structure becomes distance. They protect space, resist dependence, and interpret closeness as threat. Others fear the loss of recognition. Their structure becomes achievement. Movement never stops because stillness feels like disappearance. These are not personality traits. They are survival strategies refined into identity. Once fear becomes structural, behavior no longer feels optional. It feels necessary. This is why logic cannot easily interrupt it. The psyche is not responding to the present moment. It is responding to an internal alarm that once signaled danger. When this is understood, behavior loses its mystery. Actions that once appeared contradictory or extreme reveal coherence. The person who controls is not seeking power, but safety. The person who pleases is not weak, but protecting connection. The person who withdraws is not cold, but guarding autonomy. The person who competes is not greedy, but afraid of vanishing. Fear organizes perception before it organizes action. The world is scanned for threats to the protected value. Signals are amplified. Neutral events become charged. The psyche becomes vigilant in the direction of its central fear. What others barely notice feels urgent. What others can tolerate feels unbearable. This is why people often seem to live in different realities. They are not responding to the same dangers. Each psyche is defending a different core, and defense reshapes reality. The mind interprets information in a way that confirms the necessity of its strategy. Evidence that challenges the fear is dismissed. Evidence that supports it is magnified. The psyche always moves toward safety before it moves toward truth. Truth requires openness. Safety requires control. When safety is uncertain, truth becomes secondary. This is not moral failure. It is neurological priority. Survival precedes reflection. Understanding this dissolves confusion. You stop asking why someone behaves this way and begin sensing what they are guarding. The question shifts from evaluation to orientation. Behavior is no longer seen as random or malicious, but as directional. It points toward the fear at the center. This insight is dangerous only to illusion. It threatens the belief that people act purely out of choice or character. It reveals that much of behavior is structured around avoidance of loss. But it does not excuse harm. Explanation is not permission. It is clarity. And clarity changes the quality of response. Blame dissolves because blame depends on misunderstanding. When behavior is seen as organized fear, reaction slows. You may still set boundaries. You may still refuse participation. But you no longer personalize the behavior. You no longer absorb it as meaning about yourself. Fear loses power when it is recognized, not because it disappears, but because it becomes visible. What remains invisible controls automatically. What becomes visible enters relationship with awareness. The psyche does not need to be forced into change. It needs to feel understood. When fear is seen clearly, the system relaxes slightly. Not completely, not immediately, but enough for choice to re-enter. Enough for behavior to become less rigid. Enough for the possibility of truth to appear. At this level, understanding becomes a form of precision. You are no longer hypnotized by surface behavior. You are reading structure. And when structure is seen, confusion fades. The outer drama loses intensity because the inner logic has been revealed. Anger is rarely what it appears to be. On the surface, it presents itself as reaction, irritation, intensity, or force. But beneath its expression lies something quieter and older. Anger is not born in the moment it erupts. It arrives already charged, carrying the residue of experiences that were never fully processed. It is memory that never found language. It is the body holding what the mind could not hold at the time. When anger appears, it signals that something has been touched that belongs to the past as much as the present. The nervous system does not distinguish between then and now when an unresolved memory is activated. It responds as if the original event is happening again. The body mobilizes. Energy surges. Boundaries harden. What looks like disproportionate reaction is often proportionate to an earlier moment that was never allowed completion. Anger forms where expression was once unsafe, where truth could not be spoken, where protest was punished or ignored. It accumulates silently, becoming layered with time. Each new suppression does not erase the previous one. It stacks upon it. Over years, anger becomes dense. It waits. This waiting is not passive. It shapes personality. It sharpens sensitivity to certain triggers. It creates specific thresholds beyond which reaction becomes inevitable. The psyche organizes itself around avoiding the conditions that once silenced expression. When avoidance fails, anger takes over the task of protection. Anger is not destructive by nature. It is protective. It rises to defend a boundary that was once crossed without consent. The problem is not the existence of anger, but its displacement. When the original context is forgotten, anger attaches itself to the nearest available stimulus. The present becomes the carrier of the past. This is why anger often feels confusing. The situation does not seem to justify the intensity. Others may minimize it. Logic may dismiss it. But the body does not argue. It remembers. It reacts according to its own record of threat. Where anger erupts quickly, something once had no voice. Where it persists over time, something still waits to be recognized. Suppressing anger does not resolve it. Rationalizing it doesn't resolve it. Acting it out does not resolve it. Only recognition transforms it. Observation without reaction is the first act of integration. When anger is watched, rather than discharged, its structure becomes visible. Patterns emerge. The same themes repeat. The same injuries echo. What once felt like chaos reveals coherence. At this stage, perception sharpens. You stop taking intensity personally. You stop assuming hostility. You begin to sense that anger is not aimed at you, but speaking through you or toward you from somewhere deeper. It is not asking to be obeyed. It is asking to be understood. Anger contains information that was once ignored. It carries the shape of a wound. When allowed into awareness, it often reveals grief, fear, or shame beneath its surface. These emotions were once too overwhelming or dangerous to feel. Anger stepped in because it could mobilize energy without collapse. The nervous system prefers anger to helplessness. It prefers activation to vulnerability. This preference is not conscious. It is adaptive. Anger gives the body a sense of agency when agency was once removed. When this is understood, anger loses its moral charge. It is no longer seen as good or bad. It is seen as meaningful. And meaning changes relationship. You no longer need to eliminate anger. You need to listen to it without becoming it. As anger is integrated, it becomes less explosive. Not because it disappears, but because its message has been received. The body no longer needs to shout. The memory begins to settle into narrative rather than sensation. This is the quiet transformation that occurs when perception deepens. What once appeared as aggression reveals itself as unfinished experience seeking closure. And when closure begins, anger no longer needs to dominate the present. It becomes part of the past, integrated into awareness rather than erupting through it. The decisive shift in perception occurs when attention turns inward without collapsing into self-judgment. As long as awareness is directed outward in search of causes, responsibility, or blame, the psyche remains reactive. The world feels intrusive, provocative, unpredictable. But the moment the question changes from what is being done to me to what is being stirred within me, orientation reverses. The outer world no longer feels like a force acting upon the self. It becomes a surface that reflects internal movement. This shift does not minimize external events. It reorganizes their meaning. Circumstances remain the same, but their psychological impact changes. The individual stops being pulled into automatic identification with reaction. Space opens between stimulus and interpretation. In that space, projection becomes visible. Projection is not error, it is economy. The psyche disowns material it cannot yet hold and assigns it elsewhere. Traits, impulses, desires, and fears that threaten self-image are relocated onto others. This process protects coherence at the cost of accuracy. What is seen outside feels real because the emotion attached to it is real. The misplacement goes unnoticed because it operates beneath conscious awareness. What is rejected in others often marks a disallowed aspect of the self. The intensity of rejection correlates with the degree of suppression. Traits that provoke strong irritation usually belong to parts of the psyche that were once discouraged, punished, or deemed unacceptable. The anger is not toward the trait itself, but toward the memory of having had to abandon it. Likewise, admiration follows the same structure in reverse. What evokes fascination or idealization often signals unrealized potential. The psyche recognizes something familiar, yet distant. The admiration carries longing. It points toward a capacity that exists internally, but has not yet been lived. Projection idealizes what has been postponed. The mirror principle reveals that perception is participatory. You do not merely observe the world, you engage it through internal content. What stands out, disturbs, attracts, or moves you is not random. It is selected by the psyche according to unresolved material. The outer world becomes a diagnostic field. This understanding does not imply that everything perceived is imaginary or that responsibility dissolves into subjectivity. It clarifies relationship. It shows that emotional charge does not originate solely from events. It emerges from resonance between inner material and external trigger. Ownership is the turning point. Projection dissolves only when the psyche reclaims what it has disowned. This does not mean acting out suppressed traits or adopting admired qualities prematurely. It means acknowledging their presence internally. Recognition precedes integration. Ownership transforms reaction into information. Instead of defending against emotion, the individual begins to inquire into its source. Irritation becomes a signal. Attraction becomes a guide. Emotional responses lose their compulsive quality when they are understood as internal movements rather than external verdicts. This process is often misunderstood as self-blame, but blame implies accusation. Ownership implies contact. It is not about condemning oneself for reactions, but about tracing them accurately. The psyche becomes coherent not by eliminating complexity, but by allowing it to exist without denial. When nothing essential is disowned, energy reorganizes. The psyche no longer needs to externalize conflict. Emotional charge decreases because it no longer needs projection to carry what has been reclaimed. The world feels less provocative, not because it has changed, but because fewer internal fragments are seeking mirrors. The mirror principle restores agency without control. You cannot govern what appears in the world, but you can govern your relationship to what appears within you. This is where stability begins, not in managing others, but in recognizing internal movement without collapse. As this capacity develops, perception becomes cleaner. You no longer confuse intensity with truth. You no longer assume that emotional reactions define reality. You learn to hold experience without immediate conclusion. The outer world becomes readable because the inner world has become less divided. What once felt threatening becomes informative. What once felt personal becomes symbolic. The psyche stops fighting its own reflections and begins to integrate them. This is not detachment. It is intimacy with one's own structure. And from this intimacy arises a quieter, more grounded way of seeing. The world no longer needs to be corrected or interpreted urgently. It can be observed. And in observation, clarity replaces compulsion. Integration is not an event. It is a gradual reorganization of inner life that becomes visible through stillness rather than display. Nothing dramatic announces its arrival. There is no sudden confidence, no sharpened identity, no urge to prove understanding. What changes first is not behavior, but tension. The constant inner scanning begins to soften. The need to anticipate threat loosens its grip. The psyche no longer positions itself defensively in every encounter. When inner fragments are no longer at war, attention returns to the present moment. Energy that was once consumed by vigilance becomes available for perception. You stop watching people for signs of rejection, dominance, or approval. You stop bracing for impact. The body rests into itself. Presence replaces interpretation. This presence is not passivity. It is alert without urgency. It allows experience to unfold without immediately categorizing it as danger or opportunity. You notice tone without assigning motive. You sense emotion without absorbing it. The world feels less invasive because fewer inner parts are fighting for protection. Listening changes first. You no longer listen to respond, defend, or correct. You listen to track movement. What is forming, what is withdrawing, what is unresolved. Words become secondary to rhythm. Meaning emerges from patterns rather than statements. Response slows naturally, not from hesitation but from clarity. When the psyche is no longer fragmented, it does not rush to assert itself. It trusts its own continuity. Silence no longer feels like loss of position. It becomes a space where understanding can settle. In this state, people are no longer perceived as obstacles or puzzles to solve. They are seen as processes, moving systems shaped by history, fear, and adaptation. This perception dissolves unnecessary conflict. You stop reacting to symptoms and start recognizing structure. Quiet authority emerges here, not as dominance, but as coherence. Others sense it before they can name it. It does not demand attention. It does not persuade. It does not announce itself. It stabilizes the space simply by being stable within itself. Influence appears as a byproduct, not a goal. When your inner world is aligned, your presence carries weight without force. Words land more cleanly because they are not charged with hidden need. Boundaries are felt without being enforced aggressively. Decisions are respected because they are not entangled in justification. This authority does not seek agreement. It does not fear misunderstanding. It does not require validation to exist. It comes from having nothing essential to hide and nothing urgent to prove. The world becomes readable in a new way, not because you have learned techniques, but because distortion has decreased. You are no longer projecting unresolved material onto others. You are no longer defending against imagined threats. Perception clears because inner noise has quieted. Understanding shifts from analysis to recognition. You do not try to understand others in order to feel safe. You understand because understanding is now possible. Consciousness recognizes itself moving through different forms. Through you. Through them. This does not produce detachment. It produces grounded compassion. You see suffering without absorbing it. You see confusion without becoming confused. You see defenses without attacking them. Integration does not make life easier. It makes it cleaner. Conflict still exists. Limits still exist. Pain still appears. But none of these destabilize the self. They are met from a center that no longer fractures under pressure. Quiet authority is not a posture. It is the natural state of a psyche that has reclaimed its parts. When nothing essential is disowned, nothing external needs to be controlled. The self stands intact, and from that intactness, presence radiates without effort. In this state, you are not managing the world. You are participating in it with clarity. And that clarity, unforced and unannounced, becomes the deepest form of influence there is.